title of our symposium is Common Ground, which has a couple of meanings. First, it is the common ground of the Korean Peninsula, a nation divided in two by the decisions of those outside of the country at the end of the Second World War that went through a horrific fratricidal war only 5 years later, from 1950 to 1953, and whose war has never ended. We are now approaching the 60th anniversary in July of this year of the Korean War armistice, a temporary cessation of the fighting which has now lasted a lifetime, and the possibility of unity between North and South, although it has arisen at various times over the last 6 decades, now seems far away. The hope is still there, the possibility is still not gone, but the hostility is still very intense, not only between elements in the north and the south of Korea, but as we all know, between the United States and North Korea, a country who is still, in a very real sense, our enemy 60 years after a war supposedly ended. So the common ground is the physical ground, the territory on which Koreans reside on that bifurcated peninsula, and also the possibility within that space of commonality between this divided people. Second common ground has to do with us and those outside of Korea, including the Koreans outside of the peninsula, in this country and elsewhere, for areas of commonality, of common understanding, points of intersection, and positive engagement, which is something we'll talk about, particularly in the first session today, in various means. Above all, the focus of this symposium is in the area of art, something which is not often referred to or explored in the very heavy geopolitical discourse of the Korean Peninsula, but which has potentially, and indeed has already had in the past, a very important role to play in finding commonality and finding common ground between those of us here and North Korea, and also the north and the south of the peninsula. When we were looking at the situation just a few weeks ago, this seemed like a particularly difficult time to be holding such a symposium with this theme. The United States and North Korea were once again at loggerheads over North Korea's alleged provocations and the explosion of a nuclear device just a few weeks ago. North and South Korea have had a very testy time for the last 4 or 5 years, probably the worst time for North-South relations in several decades. We are in a time of very important political transition in both North and South Korea. A new president has just come into office in the South, and there is a leader who is still in the process of consolidating his authority in the North, having taken power from his father a little over a year ago. And then a former NBA basketball star showed up in Pyongyang out of the blue, and we discovered that there was more to North Korea than nuclear weapons and conflict, that there was possibly even some space for communication and understanding between some Americans, although one could argue Dennis Rodman does not represent in any way all of America as a typical American, but nevertheless, Rodman visited North Korea. He just left. He was the first American to ever meet with Kim Jong-un, as far as we know. And indeed, the organization which sponsored his trip, Vice, even stole our title. Shane Smith of Vice, when interviewed in the LA Times, said that the purpose of this trip was, quote, finding common ground on the basketball court, unquote. I'll have to talk to him about our rights to that phrase, but it shows there are ways, there are spaces, there are areas in which we do have commonality as human beings, as people who share a common place on this earth, and for Koreans on the peninsula of Korea to communicate, to understand each other, to even enjoy ourselves, and to appreciate beauty, art, and what we have in common. So with that, I would like to hand this over to John L. Moore for the Unify Korea project. Once again, welcome, and I hope we have a productive and engaging day today. Thank you.
I was one of the first of 6 people who met with Heng-Gil. It was the first meeting on the idea of the Unify Korea, or common ground. And, excuse me. And I must say I was sort of a doubting Thomas, because I figured, well, Heng-Gil has an idea about the unification of Korea. He wants to probably do some kind of project. He invited us to come to a sit-down meeting with food and wine, and there was only 6 of us. And I thought going into the meeting I would just go and listen and make maybe my 2 cents worth of suggestions and go back home. I was not intended to be get involved in anything such as where we're at today. And it's actually quite amazing to see the developments since that first meeting. I put down some notes because I was trying to remember that meeting, not knowing I was going to have to do this until recently. And so I'm going to just read through it very quickly. Like I said, I just thought it was going to be a group of people, a small group, which it was 6, who would listen to Heng-Gil about his ideas on the 2 Koreas and how the unification of it. And before this meeting, he had made it very clear to me, and obviously a number of other people, this was something he was very passionate and very sincere about. And he used to send me articles to read and emails to read and so forth. And so he had talked about this for well over a year before that first meeting, which was just May 26, 2012. So this is happening less than a year since that first meeting. The first meeting took place in Gallery Hall, which is in Chelsea on West 27th Street. And as I said, there were 6 of us, there was food, there was drinks, it was a nice Saturday evening, and Heng-Gil had a full agenda. A very interesting thing happened when Joe Carrero, one of the 6 people at the meeting, suggested the theme of common ground, or a landscape exhibition. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about a landscape show, a Korean and American, North and South Korean landscape exhibition possibility. And then I remember somewhere Heng-Gil said, well, I don't know if we can get Hudson River School paintings. And I think, no, we're not talking about Hudson River School paintings. We're talking about maybe contemporary works, and somehow we can do something that would, have a common ground, because the land, as we know, is common ground. We all live on it, we share it, it feeds us, it could, be brutal and cause horrible disasters, and it also depends on how we treat it and each other to survive. I've been to Korea, South Korea, a couple times. I've been to a couple exhibitions there. I know a lot of friends who are born there, particularly artists. And once I even gave a talk at a women's university in Seoul on contemporary art issues. And I've had work in 2 exhibitions. But never would I have thought that I would be involved with this project. Just no way I would ever imagine. I started to begin to think during that first meeting that Heng-Gil must have some kind of magic dust. That somehow he had 6 people, and I'm thinking, I'm not one of them. I'm just there. The others maybe thought they could be an instrument of change. But I remember very clearly, I just thought his ideas were so big, so much bigger than all of us who were seated there at that table. And that was Joel Carrero, my wife Jane Farber, Song, who was a graduate student at university, Fordham University. And I looked around and just thought that, he needs museum directors and official people and State Department people for this idea. There's no way that in this meeting that we're going to come up with some kind of idea that the U.S. government would support, or Korea. It just seemed so big. Well, as I say, I was a bit of a doubting Thomas. The other 5 members seemed to be a bit more with belief. So I really changed. And now with Rodman and his trip to see the Northern leader, it seems like, wow, you're right on the button here or something. But we'll see. We'll see. In that first meeting, I thought that number one, it's probably about two things. Heng-Gil would be interested in an action or some kind of project that would focus on raising awareness and making contact with other like-minded individuals in North, South Korea, and America. And number two, that he wanted to find some way of producing an action, a collaboration, something that would be positive, non-political, that would be a catalyst out of which something good might develop. And the next thing I know is like less than an hour in this meeting, we are an advisory council or committee. And I'm still thinking, I don't want to get this involved. But I just thought it's just, like I said, it was just too much. The people that I thought, as I said, I thought it would be State Department people, culture ambassadors, museum directors, and so forth. And lo and behold, what do we have here? Some of those very people. So you must have been spreading a lot of dust. And I don't know where you get it, but we might try to find the source if you be so kind. I do think that just the government alone wouldn't be, open to anything that we might have. Next thing I know, he's signing us positions, duties to do. And I'm, again, thinking, John, why are you getting involved in this? And then Joe Carrero, who teaches at Hunter, who's a painter, came up with this brilliant idea. Joe said, maybe we could do something on landscape. That would give us something to build up. It could be something about the North, the land we all share, all of that, and it would be non-threatening. And it might be a way to bring focus and collaboration and raise an awareness of the situation between North and South Korea. Heng-Gil, at that moment, is like, you just see things that are happening in his head. He's thinking about, yeah, I know it could be with this organization, get this people involved, and we're saying, whoa, wait a minute, there's a lot of work to be done here, and sort of, fleshing this out. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, landscape it could be beautiful, it's awe-inspiring, and all that kind of stuff. And certainly, we could build lecture series around it and so forth. And the next thing, we got an idea of Unify Korea, landscape to North, South, and America. And we can invite artists, and it could be a collaboration, and it could travel the world. Sounds very non-threatening, and a lot more possible at this moment. And basically, that's all I have to say. It was six people sitting at a table, directed there by Heng-Gil, and now there's a lot more of us. There'll be a much larger table next time. I can imagine. I hope you can afford the food and the drink. That's basically all I have to say. I just wanted to give some idea of what can happen when someone has the right magic dust to spread around. Thank you.
We are 2 minutes behind because we started late, so I will try to read my paper as soon as possible. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the Center for Korean Research here at the Columbia University. I also would like to thank the Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning, where I am working, the Art Foundation, the Korea Times in New York, Hotel Stanford, the JQSA, the Cool House, the Arts Council Korea in Seoul, and the Gallery 4 in Chelsea, as well as individual donors and the members of Korea Art Forum for their generous support for this event. I thank Professor Armstrong for hosting this international symposium. I would also like to thank Juan Kim at the Center for Korean Research for assisting to book this auditorium and promoting this event, and also Professor Doug Hostetter at the Hunter College Art Department and Professor Adam Brandt at the News for Conference for your effort to procure an auditorium. Thank you, Mr. Moore. for giving such a wonderful greeting speech. I hope I didn't grab you. And I hope you'll be the one who is anchoring our humanist standpoint and providing perspective for our collective endeavor to contribute to a world of truly open and peaceful societies. I'm convinced our hard work will help advance and expand contemporary arts and culture. And with this conviction, I'd like to thank all the audience in the auditorium for being here this afternoon and making this symposium very, very special. Without you, our vision will fail, falling back to being a mere dream instead of becoming a reality. Hence, I would like to ask for your continuing participation in our upcoming collective endeavors to realize the core idea of contemporary art in the way it was originally conceived, namely, together with it in time, not in the broad and general sense of just appearing at the same time, but in the serious and specific sense of coexistence and building a space of unison and share the feeling within the same frame of time. It will be a long journey today, a trajectory that will share for a total 6 hours, examining our misperceptions and differences. The symposium and the project Unify Korea have an intimate relationship with the politics, but we do not represent any government or their particular positions. We take an artistic, academic, and self-reflective meta-position to overcome unnecessarily escalating enmity that, if acted upon, will only result in self-destruction. As stated in the press release, this symposium is a preparation for Unify Korea project, a series of exhibitions intended to showcase works by artists from different countries in different cities in order to promote mutual trust between these countries, which are currently involved in a complex adversarial relationship regarding the situation on the Korean Peninsula. The idea of Unified Korea has emerged from a sense of urgency about the prolonged Korean conflict, which Bruce, one of the speakers today, has extraordinarily identified with a forgotten war. A disastrous possibility of mismanaging this uncertain situation, a state of war, in fact, is a nuclear war, which could spread beyond this area. This potential danger, indeed, raises the stakes, and Unified Korea is a sincere response to this heightened sense of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty about a regional explosion that could become global. 64 years ago, in 1949, Owen Rudimore, the influential editor of Pacific Affairs at the time, said something that is still valid today. Korea appears to be of such a minor importance that it tends to get overlooked, but Korea may turn out to be a country that has more effect over the situation than its apparent weight would indicate. Korea stands as a terrible warning of what can happen. Fortunately, though, we are about to begin a new era with a new leadership in all countries directly involved in East Asia and the Pacific. Now is the time to be prepared for a new opportunity that could shape a brighter future. We cannot miss this opportunity by mistrusting others or misinterpreting the times. We cannot responsibly keep the status quo, perpetuating the ongoing tension in the region. As an individual citizen, not representing the CAP, Korean Art Forum, nor this symposium or the Unified Korea, I wish to express to the incumbent leaders of both parts of Korea that you should not follow your parent footsteps. Your late fathers could not have desired you to take the same path that they took. Our parents taught us well. Koreans are especially famous about that. Our parents taught us well in order for us to live better than they did. We make a great effort to educate my children or our children in order for them to live better than us. We must live better than our parents to fulfill their wish and make their hard life worthwhile. This is true meaning of filial piety. This mandate we inherited from our parents' generation and the Korean culture, and the demand of time and urgency have brought us here today to think about what can be done and how we can end the tension in Korea. History shows that arts and politics are closely related to each other. History shows that arts and politics are closely related to each other, and they shape each other in their development. With this understanding of arts' political function, we come to the title Unify Korea, a project of contemporary art to draw public attention to the necessary role of the contemporary art in the political work of peace, peacemaking in Korea. Not only is there an intimate relationship between arts and politics, but the repeated failure of the past endeavors to engage with North Korea leaves us no option but to find an approach using arts and cultural exchanges. When all carrot and stick approaches of the United States and South Korea to engage with North Korea have thus far failed, it is ever more critical for us to try a different approach from a different starting point. Learning from past mistakes, we are mandated to identify what the missing link is in our peacemaking endeavors. And Unify Korea intends to find that missing link in arts and culture. Based on the fact that contemporary art has emerged from the ideological tension of the Cold War, the Unify Korea project intended to scrutinize the contrast between North Korean art and contemporary art through the lens of art ideological framework. The project envisions expanded boundaries for the contemporary art, which may be able to show a way forward toward eliminating the military and political tensions between North Korea and the rest of the world. If much of contemporary art claims to deal with the body politics, the Korean conflict is then a matter of contemporary art. For Korea, I quote Bruce here again, for Korea remains divided so long after the Berlin Wall fell because the Korea War and the subsequent division of the country cut so deeply into the body politic of Korea and the Korean soul, which has produced a highly hostile environment of the ideological body politics of the past 6 decades. You all know, our family cannot meet each other for past 6 decades. I call this essay Divided Identity an oxymoron, emphasizing the diversity of elements that constitute an identity on personal, national, or global levels. The title is to denote the contradictory conditions of Korea, a single nation with two parallel ideals, each claiming to represent the same nationhood. Although it might be hard in practical terms to unify these very confronting systems, there still is a hope of connecting them together in the way the morning star is related to the evening star. I question if it is in the same logic and same emotional apparatus that is at work at the base of this contradictory system in Korea, and Korean art and contemporary art. The specific fact that speakers will point out, yes, I concur with Latimer's view above. Please consider the term remnant in Geopolitical psychology. A picture of a dog head can be flipped in such a way as to be viewed an image of a rabbit's head and vice versa. Within these parallel images, there are the minor, easily ignored dots that switch their pictorial functions and their cognitive status between being known and unknown according to our shifting perceptions. Does North Korea, or the division of Korea, precisely comprise a case of remnant of our shared picture of today's liberal democratic society and global world? North Korea is a country today that is represented as unknown in the US mainstream media. It is also represented as unfit for the common popular picture of today's globally interlocked system. People who are led to believe this image of a uniquely related North Korea as the other fear the country because of the uncertainty of the unknown that permeates this line of discourse. What does this picture of North Korea as the other mean in terms of Geopolitical and its remnants? It means that North Korea calls for attention to transform the way we think about our society and today's world. The question is, what should a new vision of the global system that includes North Korea look like? What specific points do both parties have to change in order to create a new, expanded atlas that we all desire to have? What does this challenge for a new worldview mean for contemporary art? Keeping these questions in mind, we have invited 7 leading experts in their specialized field. They are Bruce Cumings, Charles K. Armstrong, Gigi Moon, Morton Travis, Yu-Yeon Kim, Soo-Jung Hyun, and Walter Clements. They will bring facts and figures to the table, reporting the current geopolitical conditions of the Korean conflict. Sorry about that. One page. Okay. So the speakers will bring facts and figures to the table, reporting the current geopolitical conditions of the Korean conflict, North Korean art, and contemporary art. The specific facts that speakers will point out will debunk widely propagated misconceptions, especially in the US mainstream media, that produce mythical illusion of North Korea, and by the same token, however, of ourselves. We want to dismantle these biases that mount obstacles to the current international struggles for peace. As for the art concerned, because we will show some examples of North Korean art and South Korean art and international art. In the slide presented to you, I hope you will find striking affinities that exist despite the obvious disparities between North Korean art and contemporary art. Today's papers are delivered in thematic order: geopolitical context, North Korean art, and contemporary art. After the presentation of each time, a discussion will follow, which will be moderated by Doug Hostetter, Jane Farber, and Gordon Knox, respectively. Walter Clements will give concluding remarks at the end of the day. I invite all of you in the auditorium to actively engage in the discussions and the debates. You know, discussions and debates depend on their participants for a meaningful outcome. Good and memorable discussions and productive debates can only emerge when they get heated. I look forward to your provocative comments, sharp opinions, critical reflections, and there are no stupid questions. Due to time limitation, I would like to leave the individual introductions of the speakers to the moderators. I hope that's okay with you. Without hesitation, I would like to thank J.P. Jukauskas, who edited our text, Raul Alexander, who designed the website and posters, Sunny Shin, Eunha Cho, and Doyoung Hwang, who have volunteered and tirelessly worked on many small tasks that just never stopped emerging while we are preparing this symposium. I also would like to thank all volunteer artists and students from Columbia University, Pratt Institute, New York University, who are helping us today to make this event forward and smoothly. I especially thank Tae-Hyun Kim, one of the co-founders of the Korea Art Forum, a genuine philanthropist, and a young man who I am proud of. The fact that who I am proud of because of the fact that he is originally from Korea. And that fact indicates that there is a hope to eliminate the conflict we are dealing with today. At last, but not least, I thank all speakers for presenting your extraordinary and time-consuming hard work, and my kudos also goes to the moderators for their considerate generosity in leading the discussion.
Thank you, Heng-Gil. The first panel will be on the geopolitical context of the Koreas. Our first presenter will be Bruce Cumings. Bruce teaches international history, modern Korean history, East Asian political economy, taught since 1987, and where he is the Gustav and Anne Swift Distinguished Service Professor and Chairman of the History Department. He is the author of the 2-volume study, The Origins of the Korean War, War and Television, Korea's Place in the Sun, Modern History, Parallax Visions, Making Sense of America and East Asia, North Korea, Another Country, and co-authored of Invention of the Axis of Evil, and recently published The Dominion from Sea to Sea, Pacific Ascendancy and American Power. If you've ever read any of Bruce's books, you will know that it is a welcomed and refreshing look at this part of the world. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Korea Art Forum, Common Ground, the Columbia Center for Research on Korea, the Unify Korea Project, and especially Heng-Gil, who has organized this and did so much to bring us all here. I have a paper that is on the web, and I'm not going to read my paper or even discuss it all that much. Instead, I wanted to do a little bit of photo art, since even though I'm by no means an artist, this is essentially an artistic gathering. Luckily, these will come up in a minute. My paper basically argues that in spite of the general commentary that we hear all the time that North Korea cheats, it can't be trusted to carry out agreements, all it really wants to do is just build a nuclear arsenal. Unlike our troubles with Iran or Saddam Hussein's Iraq before he was overthrown, North Korea actually has made agreements with the United States that not only were deeply in the American interest, but also in the world, the region, and the world's interest, particularly shutting down all of their plutonium supply and production from 1994 to 2002. Okay, now we're ready to go. And I welcome your reading of my paper. It starts with a near war in June 1994, something that I think is very well known to specialists, but somehow doesn't get into ordinary commentary on our relations with North Korea. Bill Clinton came very near going to war in June 1994. Only the intervention of Jimmy Carter, who flew to Pyongyang, first American president, to go there and talk to Kim Il-sung. In the course of their discussions, they worked out a freeze on the Yongbyon plutonium facility, and that freeze lasted, as I said, for 8 years. It was a major achievement, but it came in the context of another Korean War, another catastrophic war, very narrowly avoided. Now, you all know that in 2010 there were clashes in the West Sea, shelling of islands, sinking of the Cheonan South Korean ship. Last spring, Leon Panetta, the defense secretary at the time, said that we've been within an inch of war with North Korea for months. And I ended my paper on that particular comment because it's just an astonishing, although implicit, admission of failure. 25,000 American combat troops occupied South Korea in September of 1945. We still have 28,000 there today. We obviously have continuing problems with North Korea, and yet we hardly ever have a sincere effort to engage with the North to bring an end to the Korean War and get a peace treaty, and we run the risk almost every day of another war. Now, how do I move this along? This photo art is Kim Il-sung, circa 1946. There he is in 1948. Here he is meeting Che Guevara in 1968. And here is Kim Jong-un. And what I want you to pay attention to is the sideburns. North Korea has made a very conscious effort to present Kim Jong-un as not just the successor to Kim Jong-il, but also the third in the line of the founder of the country. And of course, he bears a very strong resemblance to his grandfather. One of the things that North Korea is very good at, they don't provide a lot of information to help us understand them, but when they want to tell us something, they tell us. And the transition to Kim Jong-un could not be a stronger indication of the existence in North Korea of a dynasty. And with this man only being 30, one that's likely to last a long time. And of course, when you look back over the centuries of Korean history, this is nothing new. Kings and princes and grandsons have succeeded each other and were always topics of more fascination on the part of the Korean people. There he is again with his haircut. To his right, from our standpoint, is one of the elderly generals in North Korea. One of the problems that Kim Jong-un has at the age of 30 is that at least a couple of years ago, the National Defense Commission, which is the most powerful agency in North Korea, more than half of the members were over 80. And in a patriarchy, it's very difficult even for a supreme leader to contradict this patriarchy. That's probably the best picture I have to illustrate the way in which Kim Jong-un had just flowed into his role as a politician and as a leader, something that his father, Kim Jong-il, had a great deal of difficulty doing for 17 years. Now, I have here a fairly harsh characterization of what I've learned over 20 years of dealing with beltway discussions in North Korea. I think very few people in Washington have an understanding of where this regime came from. It was always seen as a Soviet implant or a stooge. The Soviet Union collapsed. North Korea has persisted for 23 years, and yet there's no real change in the view of North Korea. Obviously, it's no longer a Soviet puppet, but it's seen as an illegitimate regime that really stands for nothing, has no interest that Washington folks think they need to take seriously, has no support from its people, and will soon collapse. In fact, the collapse scenario has been dominant since the Berlin Wall fell. With Republicans, you get the idea that harsh pressure on the regime will force a change, a regime change, or even a collapse. With Democrats, an engagement process, at least during the Clinton years, that nonetheless furthers the goal of a kind of velvet form of regime change. If the regime does not change, and if it moves in the direction of a nuclear arsenal, then the use of force is justified to prevent that from happening. That's essentially what Bill Clinton and his advisors thought in 1994, and what George Bush and his advisors thought in 2002 and 3. I think all of these assumptions are false, and in the light of recent history, irrational. Now, the one period since the Korean War when engagement really bore some fruit, the fruits of engagement, the title of my paper, was from 1998 to 2000, when Kim Dae-jung became president, inaugurated after his election in December 1997, and changed his policy, changed South Korean policy towards the north quite radically in ways I'll discuss in a minute. And then he helped to prevail upon the Clinton administration through what was called the Perry process to begin an engagement with North Korea. As Mr. Perry said in 1999, we want to deal with North Korea not as we would like it to be, but as it is. And I remember when I heard that, I thought, well, a little bit of clarity, as an alcoholic would say, during a sober moment, a little bit of clarity finally entered the U.S.-North Korean relationship. At that time, as I said, we had already frozen their plutonium production, and what Kerry and Clinton were trying to do was to shut down their medium and long-range missiles and ideally get North Korea into the missile technology control regime. That is General Cho Myung-nok, who has since passed away, one of the most powerful commanders in North Korea. He came to visit Bill Clinton in October 2000. I remember seeing this picture and being amazed that a North Korean general in full regalia would be admitted to the White House, let alone to meet the president. He was there to negotiate this missile deal, and 2 weeks later, Madeleine Albright was in Pyongyang in late October. I've always liked this picture. They almost make a couple. Same tailor, same diet. Anyway, Madam Secretary was there to negotiate Bill Clinton's arrival in Pyongyang in December 2000 to sign this agreement. Kim Jong-il had said if Bill Clinton does him the favor of a summit visit in Pyongyang, he would join the missile technology control regime and limit their missiles to 300 miles and, of course, limit whatever delivery capability they might have for nuclear weapons. As we all know, the 2000 election lasted 6 weeks until the Supreme Court decided who won it. And Al Gore was out in spite of getting 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. Bill Clinton never got to Pyongyang. He was still thinking of going in December, but the transition team, Condoleezza Rice and others in the incoming Bush administration, basically said they would not honor the agreement. They let it fall between the stools. You can read Madeleine Albright's memoirs and see how astonished she was that this agreement was not fulfilled. The Bush administration did essentially nothing about North Korea for 18 months until September 2002, when it announced its preemptive doctrine, preemptive war doctrine, which was the prelude to the invasion of Iraq, what Condoleezza Rice called anticipatory self-defense. North Korea was also one of the top countries targeted under the preemptive doctrine. This is, of course, very dangerous to those of you that know what a hair trigger alert the two Koreas are on any day of the week, where plans for preemption and counter-preemption are constantly being mulled over by commanders on either side. After the Iraq War seemed to be successful in April and May 2003, with President Bush basically declaring victory, an attack on the North seemed quite likely. Donald Rumsfeld told the New York Times reporter that if I were Kim Jong-il, I'd be running around wondering what might hit me next. Words to that effect. Very irresponsible statement, but nonetheless, that's what Rumsfeld was known for. China stepped in with three-party talks and six-party talks and got some negotiations going that headed this problem off, but what really headed it off was North Korea saying Saddam Hussein had no nuclear weapons. He got rid of his WMDs. He invited the UN inspectors to come in. They did their work, and then the U.S. invaded. That's not going to happen to us. And they said this, if they said it once, they said it 1,000 times between the preemptive doctrine in September and the invasion in March. Now, North Korea lately, of course, has specialized in sending off missiles. Rockets or missiles. In the press, if North Korea launches a long-range missile to put up a satellite, it's a rocket. It's an attempt to perfect an ICBM capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. If South Korea or Japan put up a satellite, then it's a benign effort to enhance their technology. This is the North Korean long-range rocket. This is the South Korean, which they've tested 3 times, and finally, just like the North Koreans, finally got it up successfully with the help of Russian technology. This is a Japanese missile. The Japanese have been putting missiles up and satellites in outer space for years now. This is the environment that North Korea lives in. Any general in Pyongyang would want the same capability that South Korea and Japan want, and yet this context, this essential context, is very rarely mentioned in discussions of North Korea's missile capabilities. The difference between an intercontinental ballistic missile and a rocket, the differences are many. One is you need a re-entry shield, which is very hard to manufacture, and you need to test it several times before it works. You have to have targeting on re-entry, and you have to have warheads. And as far as I can read in the New York Times and elsewhere, North Korea still does not have the capability to put a warhead on a rocket. Kim Jong-il, Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Bill Clinton were 4 people who negotiated a number of very helpful agreements that represent a kind of 10-year hiatus between the hostility between North and South that went before 1998 and the hostility that has proceeded ever since President Lee Myung-bak came into office in 2009. The 2007 Summit Agreement is less well known than the one in 2000 that Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il made, but it was a very important one because we had the Cheonan incident, the Yeonpyeong Island shelling. This is the 2007 summit. See Kim Jong-il still wearing the same outfit. There is a rare Kim Il-sung-like smile on the face of Kim Jong-il. And here is the 2007 schematic map of the 2007 agreement. It would have taken the Kaesong export zone, which is by far the biggest fruit of North-South economic collaboration. There are almost 50,000 North Korean workers working just north of the DMZ in Kaesong. And in spite of all the enmity of recent years, that particular enterprise has not been disrupted by either the North or the South, which is an indication that they put a great deal of value on it. The port at Daeju was going to be constructed or deepened. More dockyards at Nampo. They would go around the southwest of North Korea, a region that has always been the wealthiest part of North Korea, and to try and bring that out into a very vibrant Northeast Asian political economy, Daeju being basically a long stone's throw from Incheon Airport and from Seoul. But above all, a peace agreement on the West Sea was negotiated, which would finally bring the tensions that have existed there for over a decade under some form of control. The West Sea conflicts have happened mainly in the spring and usually over fishing or crabbing rights. But in 1999, South Korea sank a North Korean ship and 20 or 30 soldiers lost their lives, sailors. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a double-digit number. I remember reading that in the paper and then thinking, well, North Korea is not going to take this line down. But they did because they were preparing the summit with Kim Dae-jung in June 2000. Skirmishes and deaths occurred again, but when the West Sea clashes and the sinking of the Cheonan happened, very rarely was this background mentioned. Thank you. The South maintains a northern limit line that goes 7 miles within 7 miles of North Korea's shore. That's a violation of international law. North Korea, like everybody else, gets a 12-mile limit. Henry Kissinger said that the northern limit line was in violation of international law back in the 70s. So you have this area of tension and conflict and really irrationality. But an incident there could easily start ratcheting up and escalating until we're back in the Korean War. And I suppose that's what Secretary of Defense Panetta was talking about when he said we've been within an inch of war for months with North Korea. Again, Kim Jong-il's diplomacy, in this case with Bill Clinton in the summer of 2009. Bill Clinton with his best imitation of a communist apparatchik. Here he is with Prime Minister Koizumi. You'll recall that Koizumi went to Pyongyang twice for negotiations with Kim Jong-il. Now, I don't have time. I only have a minute or so left. But the question, what is President Obama's North Korea policy, is still a good one. It's been called strategic patience. It's not a strategy, but it certainly has been patient. It's patient enough to do nothing while North Korea builds its arsenal and perfects a nuclear warhead. Hillary Clinton came into the office of Secretary of State talking about a power struggle in North Korea. Kim Jong-il had had a stroke a few months earlier. She saw a power struggle that nobody else did. But when Kim Jong-il died, the administration again expected a power struggle. And what they don't ever imagine is that North Korea is not Soviet Union after Stalin or China after Mao. It is a stable succession system based on principles of dynastic succession. They don't ask themselves what happened when Kim Il-sung died in 1994. The answer was nothing happened. I know that after Barack Obama came into office, people in the State Department presented him with a dossier of the negotiations that had been done or culminated in the 2000 near agreement on North Korea's missiles and other negotiations with North Korea. The goal being to get Obama to encourage the North to again freeze its plutonium facility, buy out the missiles, rejoin four-party talks from the late 1990s on ending the Korean War, work on normalization. All these things were doable. Of course, Iran is Obama's most neuralgic problem, but as far as I can tell, it's not one subject to diplomacy. North Korea has been a problem subject to diplomacy, and that's a major point I want to leave you with. Will we ever satisfy ourselves that the North has given up all its plutonium and atomic bombs? The North has been digging underground since the Korean War, and they have something like 15,000 underground facilities of a national security nature. Most of their army is underground. We're never going to be able to find that last atomic bomb that they might have secreted at some point, just secreted away. But we can nail down what we can nail down, which would be to cap the program now before it becomes a fully operational nuclear and delivery capability. Americans seem to think that diplomacy is what you do with your friends and you deny it to your enemies, so we have no relations with Iran or with North Korea. diplomacy emerged on this earth for enemies to deal with each other. And it's really the one thing American presidents, time and time again for the last 60 years, have failed to invoke, with few exceptions in the 1990s, to deal non-violently with North Korea and see if there's something that we can get out of it. I think I've already covered these points. What I'd like to end with is to argue that we can go back to the 1990s, back to that future, normalize relations with North Korea in return for capping, a verified cap on their existing nuclear and missile programs, go back and recognize the achievements of North-South reconciliation. The third point, I think, is one we never hear, but I think it's been an acute awareness on the part of experts in the last few years, and that is the U.S. seems much more at home with the remnants of the Park Chung-hee dictatorship, namely Im Young-bak and Park Geun-hye, than with the opponents of that dictatorship who paid such a cost in fighting it, namely Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. Roh Moo-hyun went out and Im Young-bak came in. There was just a very audible sigh of relief in Washington. And I think the idea that our real friends are on the ROK's right wing, the anti-communist right wing, is just a recipe for endless division and confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. What we should do is be an honest broker in bringing the two Koreas together as the only power that favors and would benefit tremendously from reunification. It would allow us to balance Japan, China, and Russia, and bring North Korea into the security system that the U.S. built after World War II as a neutral party. All of this, I think, is deeply in the American and world interest, not to mention the interest of peace in Korea. Thank you very much for your patience.
I want to add one thing to Bruce's very enlightening presentation, and that is that when Madeleine Albright visited North Korea in 2000 and met with Kim Jong-il, she brought with her a basketball signed by Chicago Bulls Michael Jordan, which is on prominent display. I've seen it in the International Friendship Exhibition Hall in the Yeoham Mountains north of Pyongyang. So this is not the first time basketball diplomacy has been tried with North Korea and the United States, and perhaps this is the sign of things to come. I will mostly talk about North Korea here and what I think is perhaps North Korea's understanding of how it should and does engage with the world. So I hope this is somewhat of a compliment to Bruce's remarks. But I want to talk a little bit about geopolitics, which gets me off from the paper that I submitted. And perhaps as a gesture to my colleague, Atri Spivak, a very renowned scholar of literature, I will begin with a reference to the British author Martin Amis, who, writing of The Nation in August 1953, made a very prescient remark. He said, I don't have the exact quote, but in effect he said, this was a month after the Korean War armistice had been signed, a conflict which freezes the status quo without a political resolution will be an endless site of strife unless there is finally a political solution found. And there are three areas of the world where we can see this happening now. This is 1953. Kashmir, Palestine, and Korea. And it's fascinating that these three are, in fact, even today, 60 years later, the sites of perhaps the most intractable conflicts in the world where political semi-solutions put into place after World War II have never moved us toward a viable, working political solution. North Korea is often portrayed in our media, and we see it over and over again every day these days, as the most isolated country on earth, with a leftover from the Cold War that is stuck in another time, disconnected to the world as we know it. This is partly true, to be sure. North Korea is isolated by the standards of today's network world, which means primarily the internet. There is very little internet access, although there is some. Emails can be exchanged with, not usually with individuals, but with collective subscribers, as it were, in North Korea. Mobile phones, for the most part, do not contact with the outside world, although there are many mobile phones in North Korea today. And travel in and out of the country is highly restricted. There are very limited economic contacts with the outside world, to a great extent because of sanctions led by the United States. But we should not think that the policy of the North Korean regime since its founding in 1948 was one of total isolation, to keep North Korea out of the world, but rather North Korea has practiced what I would call a policy of selective engagement, based on the regime's perception of its own interests, driven by the goal of self-determination and the avoidance of dependency. And this is, to a great extent, a product of its own history, the history of North Korea itself and its predecessors on the peninsula. The goal of North Korea is not to keep its country away from the world, but to control the context that it has. Some of the historical background has to do with the view of traditional Korean subservience to China, which I'll get to in a moment, to the memory of the brutal colonial exploitation by Japan, North Korea's own experience in the Cold War, not just resisting the U.S. and South Korea, but also navigating the sometimes very tricky conflict between China and the Soviet Union, its two most important backers. And finally, in the post-Cold War period, North Korea has tried to adapt to changing circumstances through modifying, and again, in a very careful and selective way, its economic reform and its connections to the outside world, while avoiding any potential threat to the security and stability of the regime. So that if we want to know why North Korea builds missiles or rockets and tests nuclear devices, rather than joining the international community as we in the West think it should or could, we have to understand that its priority, as indeed for any country, is its national sovereignty and the maintenance of its political system. And only secondarily, although we certainly, I think, want to do this, economic change and improvement. And only understanding how North Korea came to this point historically can we understand how it does and will engage with the outside world, including with us. The word that Koreans used for centuries in its relationship with China, particularly during the period of the Ming Dynasty and especially after the Japanese invasions of the late 16th century, was sade, or to serve the great. It reflected the awe and respect that Koreans had for Chinese civilization and power, and it comes ultimately from the Chinese philosopher Mencius. But in the 20th century, as Korea became embroiled in inter-imperialist conflicts among Japan, Russia, China, Europe, the United States, and others, this once valorized term sade became a pejorative, sade-jui, or serving the great ism, or flunkyism, a term you still see in North Korea today. Therefore, the antithesis of sade was juche, or self-reliance, as it's often inadequately translated. And this became, by the late 1960s, although it was used in colonial Korea and in the South, a guiding principle of the state, and indeed an elaborate philosophy. But what it really meant fundamentally, and often it was a rather vague term in its articulation, but as Bruce Cumings and others have written about this, it had to do fundamentally with a preservation of national sovereignty and independence, a highly nationalist, Korea-centric view of the world. And the economic implosion of North Korea in the 1990s seemed like the logical and self-destructive extreme of juche, and that it was often thought that that would be abandoned. But in fact, the idea of juche was not abandoned. It only became transformed and modified. And to this day, the ideal of independence and absolute sovereignty is what guides North Korea well into the 21st century. In the post-Cold War period, after the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union and Mongolia, North Korea began to add terms to its ideological lexicon, talking about 우리식 사회주의, or socialism of our style. In other words, not the failed socialism of the Soviet bloc, but something uniquely Korean, which was always what Juche in many ways meant. And under Kim Jong-il, the term Songun, or military first, which emphasized the leading role of the military in the society, and related to, of course, the necessity, as they understood it, of the strongest possible defense against a hostile outside world, in which many of the old friends that North Korea had during the Cold War period were now gone, and some had even become adversaries, or at least distant friends. And yet, there was a certain flexibility, and this is another point that's very important to keep in mind about understanding how Juche and such terms operated in guiding North Korean policy. As long as the people's idea of independence, as 우리식 사회주의, our style socialism was defined, was maintained, North Korea could engage in limited experiments in economic reform in the first post-Cold War decade, in engaging with the South, even with the United States, as we've seen, and with others as well. There was establishment of new free economic and trade zones in the northeast of North Korea, and then later in Suniju in the northwest. There was discussion of investment, which then did bear some fruit with the South, and so forth. So again, Juche was never about isolation, about autarky, but about the determination of North Korea's own destiny. And indeed, our style socialism could in theory be compatible with market reform, and for a time at the beginning of the 2000s, it seemed very much that North Korea was following this path. That was a short-lived period, in large part because of the new crisis, as Bruce has discussed in 2002 with the United States over its nuclear program. There was a pulling and some unexpected results of the economic reform, but mostly I think because of North Korea's new difficulties with the outside world, there was a pulling back from this reform. And in 2005, North Korea seemed to have returned to a more unengaged and unreformed economic approach. We now have some indication that under Kim Jong-un there is already a return to various types of agricultural and industrial reform and a reconnection with the outside world. Furthermore, in 2008, when Kim Jong-il disappeared from the scene for several months, the North Korean leadership was focused on the transition, and that we now know the transition to Kim Jong-un, which emerged into the public eye in early 2009, was made official at the party conference of 2010, and immediately after Kim Jong-il's death in December 2011, there was a great deal of emphasis in the North Korean media about this new leader who was a military genius, man of charisma, a glorious leader, and a faithful heir to the revolutionary tradition of his father and grandfather. Above all, associated with his grandfather, as we've seen in those wonderful photos, even the same haircut, the same paunch, the same suit, to remind the North Koreans of a past which was, in many ways, much better than the suffering that they had endured in much of Kim Jong-il's rule, and also of a leader that still is widely venerated and respected in North Korea today. Kim Jong-un was thought by some to be at least potentially a reformer, but as so far there has not been a lot of fruits of re-engagement with South Korea and the U.S. The rocket launch has just been in the media so much, and the third nuclear test of 2006 and 2009 brought once again the condemnation of the U.S., the United Nations, South Korea, and Japan, and as well China, which seems to be a bit more ambivalent about their Korean ally than before. In my view, these sorts of activities are carrying out largely for internal purposes to demonstrate to his own people that Kim Jong-un is the strong leader that they should have, that he is willing to stand up to the outside world. But for all the talk of reactions to Kim Jong-un's actions, or North Korea's actions, it does not appear that North Korea is likely to be weakened, much less brought to collapse by external pressure. And indeed, there's quite a bit of evidence that the general standard of life economically in North Korea has improved, and certainly the transition to Kim Jong-un's leadership has gone smoothly and according to script. The U.S. and South Korea, as well as China and other countries, will in some ways inevitably be partners in the process of change that we are beginning to see in North Korea, but cannot determine it, as no other outsiders have been able to determine much of their frustration in North Korea's destiny in the past. However North Korea engages with the outside world, whether we like it or not, it will do it in its own way. For the future, and I want to conclude with some speculation on where we might go geopolitically. Once the excitement over the nuclear test dies down, and I think it will, as it has in the past, such events, we have to return to engagement, to dialogue with the DPRK, and above all, the two large countries with the most direct interest on the Korean Peninsula, China and the United States, must discuss with each other, and in particular with the Koreas, two sides, and the Koreas with each other, over how to move forward. What I hope will happen, what we can hope, perhaps not expect this to lead to, is appropriately now on the 60th anniversary of the armistice, something that will move the peninsula forward to a genuine peace, that will prove Kingsley Amos both right and wrong, that a lack of political solution will lead to greater and continuous conflict, but that a genuine solution will lead to peace and to unity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. We have just a few minutes now. While I will try to continue this discussion between you, and then we will open it to the wider audience. The question that keeps coming to my mind is, at the end of World War II, we had divided countries in Vietnam, in Germany, and Korea. I recently returned from Vietnam that was celebrating the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which ended direct American involvement in Vietnam. And then in late 80s, early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and East and West Germany began their reunion. What happened with Korea? Why can Korea be the exception to the rest of the world in this situation?
Well, regarding Vietnam, the answer is very easy. They, as in Fish Called Wanda, one of the characters said, well, they kicked your ass, didn't they? The Vietnamese won the war, and the U.S. suffered really its most ignominious defeat in history, one made worse by the helicopter scenes on top of buildings near the embassy in 1975. So that's undoubtedly the outcome that Kim Il-sung would have liked to see in 1953 or at any point after that. But the Korean War ended in stalemate, with the status quo ante restored and essentially no big problem solved except the defense of South Korea. In the case of Germany, that is something directly relevant to the Korean problem, because the manner of unification, and those of you that followed it at the time would remember it happened very quickly, with the West Germans essentially extending their system to East Germany at great cost to themselves, but also with very little concern about whatever fruits or development there had been under East Germany. They just extended the West German system, its laws, its constitution, and so forth. That has been certainly the preferred plan for unification on the part of conservative South Koreans, which would be just to get rid of the regime and extend the South Korean system to the north. And of course, that's what the North is most afraid of. It's one of the reasons why, since the Berlin Wall fell, there has been nothing except, as I discussed in my remarks a few minutes ago, a very little movement toward reunification. Kim Dae-jung's policy was one of reconciliation over a long period of time rather than reunification. But I think it is very important to realize that of the countries divided after World War II, you could throw in Austria, which was divided and occupied quite similarly to Korea, but the Soviets and the Americans made a deal in 1955 at the height of the Cold War to withdraw Soviet troops from Austria, withdraw foreign troops, and unify the country. Taiwan and China were divided by the Korean War. They still haven't been reunited. But clearly, Korea is the one remaining country in which the national division is still the most important issue long after all these other problems have been settled, for better or worse.
Yeah, let me, I think, encapsulate that in a very simple way, which is that comparing Korea to Vietnam and Germany, there's a military stalemate on the Korean Peninsula. Vietnam's solution really isn't feasible. There could be a war, but it would be tremendously destructive, and no one wants that. At least most sane people don't want that. And as far as the German comparison goes, North Korea refuses to roll over and die. So it's just not comparable to East Germany.
I work for the Mennonite Central Committee, which is a relief development service wing of the Mennonite Church. It's one of the historic peace churches, and we're one of the few organizations that has worked both in North Korea and in South Korea. And I was visiting our projects in North Korea a couple of years ago, and I remember coming back just thinking that the North Koreans are scared to death of the United States. They are expecting an attack almost at any time. You saw preparations all over the place. People were obviously afraid. And yet, you looked at North Korea, and it was a country that was barely feeding itself. I mean, we're involved in nutritional work there, and we know what it's like for children in North Korea. And I was there for the party celebration, so we saw the big military march, and there was a lot of brouhaha in the West about, the latest missile that they brought and showed for the first time. It was carried on the back of a tractor-trailer truck. And we have, the Eisenhower cruising in the Western Sea that probably carries more firepower than their entire military. And it was clear to me that North Korea cannot really be a threat to the United States. And yet, the thought occurred to me that perhaps the United States really wanted the North Koreans to believe that the United States would attack at any time. And we do regular military exercises all around their borders. And it's not for fear of North Korea per se, but because it gives us a good chance to keep our troops in South Korea and Okinawa and Japan. Could that be true? And could this all be really about China and the U.S. and Korea only being a bit player in the midst of this for a much larger picture?
Actually, this more for you.
Well, I don't think it's likely that the United States would attack Korea out of the blue one day. As I said earlier, it's more likely that a war could develop out of a ratcheting up of a relatively minor incident. But I think what what does frighten the North Koreans, and would frighten me if I were a commander there, is that the U.S. targets North Korea with nuclear weapons, and had hundreds of nuclear weapons in the South from 1958 to 1991. And when you talk to, as I have, at least one former commander of the 8th Army during that period, their strategy in case the North Koreans invaded again was what they called a T+1 strategy. T was the time of the invasion, +1 was to use nuclear weapons if the North Koreans were succeeding, and Seoul was likely to fall. Every specialist knows that this is true. It's, however, something that doesn't get into the newspapers very, very often. But one reason the North Koreans jam so much of their army up close to the DMZ is so they can get across it and mingle with soldiers and civilians in the South before we would use nuclear weapons. Now, in 1991, battlefield nuclear weapons were withdrawn by the first George Bush, President H.W. Bush, on the grounds that our precision-guided high-explosive weapons of a conventional type would do the same work that the nuclear weapons would do without all the collateral damage of using nukes. But still, it's true. The USS Washington, a nuclear submarine, was in South Korean waters. It pulled in at the port of Chinhae 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it is a submarine capable of taking down North Korea in a matter of minutes in a hailstorm of missiles with multiply independent targeted warheads. And I think you have to sometimes put yourself in the other guy's shoes and imagine what you would feel, what you would think as a small country confronting the enormous panoply of force that the U.S. can bring to bear any place in the world. The U.S. now spends more than all other countries in the world combined on defense. So we're talking about the policemen of the world, and I don't think one should make any bones about it. That's our job these days. So North Korea is under threat. I don't think, as I said, that the U.S. has plans to attack North Korea. It's just a matter of if something happened on the peninsula, like the Cheonan escalating, then these war plans could gear up, and North Korea might well face being attacked with nuclear weapons.
I just want to add that whether or not the U.S. plans to attack Korea or is likely to, the sense of threat from the U.S. justifies extraordinary suffering and oppression within that society. So that it could be a very different place if somehow that sense of threat was lifted. I'm not sure how that would happen, but certainly North Korea is in many ways what it is because of this feeling of threat from the outside world and from the U.S. in particular. And it maintains its viability despite this tremendous suffering economically and otherwise, because they feel the need to defend themselves against this threat.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 10 minutes, and we would be glad to take questions from the floor. Please identify yourself, and if you come from an institution, identify the institution, and give a question, not a lecture. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Jay Halpin, and I'm retiring from Columbia University. I wanted to follow up your question, which is why does the U.S. do it? What is the U.S. Nothing can shake it from the 65 years or 75 years of animosity and hostility toward this small little country which belongs united with its sister, cousin people in the South. What is the perversion, or what is it's not the extractive industries anymore. What is it that drives U.S. policy to be hostile to this one small piece of the world?
Well, I guess Charles and I will continue our monthly show here, but I think I meant to respond to Doug's last point about China, but I think what really drives our policy is what drives most of the Pentagon activities, which is inertia, in that we defeated Japan in 1945, and yet we still have 50,000 troops in Japan. We defeated Germany and still have tens of thousands of troops there. We had a stalemate in Korea. 28,000 American troops still in Korea 60 years after that war ended. Once the Pentagon gets hold of the base, they like to hold on to them. It gives officers a chance to confront the real enemy and get medals so they can get promoted through the ranks. But fundamentally, I think it is just a call on our resources that most Americans pay no attention to, but is very, very valuable to the U.S., not in the sense that we are about to make war on North Korea or China, but that we have the second largest economy in the world contained with a perimeter of bases around China, and troops on the territory of the third largest economy, Japan, so that Japan's defense autonomy is still compromised. They still are not independent in terms of their defense, and you can see that this is particularly a neuralgic issue among Japan's current leaders, who want more independence, but don't really want to send the American troops home, and we don't want to send them home either. We have our troops on the territory of most of our major competitors: England, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Spain, Italy. Our bases are all over the place, hundreds and hundreds of them. So it is a kind of hidden in plain sight American basing strategy that has, in my view, shut down the activity or the action of realpolitik since World War II, in that Japan and Germany in particular do not really dispose of their own defense. And so we don't face the problems that we faced with Japan and Germany before 1945.
That's all right.
But I just wanted to say the last thing about China. North Korea is a wonderful foil for China from the standpoint of the Pentagon and Washington, in that their ICBMs aren't very good and China's are obsolescent, and anti-ballistic defense pointed at North Korea, which has been developing for a couple of decades now, also can serve as an anti-ballistic missile defense for China. We can say how horrible the North Koreans are, their terrible communist system, dictatorship, things that we don't say about China but that people think about it. And we're able to maintain a good economic relationship with China in spite of, more or less, with the Obama pivot, really deepening our military containment of that country in the last, well, really since Obama came into office. So North Korea is just a handy stooge to use as a foil to build up anti-ballistic missile defense, to have carriers sent into the Yellow Sea, which China complains about, and of course to deepen our historic involvement with our bases in the region.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, Bob Harris, Columbia alum. Reunification will make a lot of sense for the United States, as you said, Professor Cumings, but not for China. Particularly, in light of what you just said, this Obama pivot of, greater containment. So, what do you suggest to bring China on board for the possibility of reunification?
Well, Charles,
to try to get them, into a dialogue about this possibility. If the United States is, eventually do this too.
Well, I know Charles has an opinion on this question too, but I think the June 2000 summit was absolutely crucial in a formula for an American brokered reconciliation process on the Korean Peninsula. Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il met in Pyongyang, and Kim Jong-il told Kim Dae-jung that he would not object to the continued stationing of American forces in the South if the U.S. became an honest broker to bring the two Koreas together and to normalize relations with North Korea. And that formula would also meet China's major objection to unification, which would be a unification under South Korean auspices in which American troops might again come to the Yalu River. By keeping the troops south of the DMZ, China would feel less threatened. I think it's true that the U.S. is the only power that really can benefit by supporting Korean reunification. Japan is like France used to be with the two Germanys that likes Korea so much it's happy there are two of them. And with China, there is really no movement that I can see toward reunification, or support for reunification, although China does have, I think, a much better policy than we've had in that they recognized Seoul in 1992 and have had good, more or less good relations with both Seoul and Pyongyang for the last more than 20 years. So the U.S. is really the outlier in that respect.
Sorry, you can go on to the next one. I share the same opinion.
Okay. Okay, we probably have time for one more question. If there's, yes.
Hi, my name is Sung-Hook Lee. I belong to a faith community, United Methodist Church, and I am part of the United Methodist Women's Organization within the denomination, 1 million members across the country. What we've been focusing on is on peace. How do we achieve peace and reconciliation? So we've been thinking a lot, we've been talking a lot about the impact of women and militarism, how military bases, particularly U.S. involvement in various bases, affects women's lives. So we've been telling stories about women's lives all across the world, and particularly around Korea. And what got me thinking, as Charles Armstrong and both of you have been sharing today, saying the real solution is about genuine peace or genuine resolution. Given, for instance, the current Obama administration with their posturing of the so-called strategic patience, how do we get there? How do we? What is genuine diplomacy or genuine peace? And what I was so inspired about for this event is the use of art. Finding common ground through something other than the political process. If that's kind of at a stalemate, how do we find that? And I just thought, art is great. What other, I'm coming from a place of trying to tell stories of women impacted by war, impacted by militarism. But what other ways is there? When you ended by saying genuine resolution, what practically is there to resort to?
Well, we've been staying at a pretty high level in this conversation about states, governments, and diplomacy, but I think there's a very important role to be played by ordinary citizens. And reconciliation is not just between governments, it's between people, between individuals. And that, I think, is a very important component of bringing peace to Korea and Northeast Asia. There are many channels through which this can go. And I think there are a lot of issues of peace, certainly in South Korea and in Japan and the East Asian region in general, that individuals, NGOs, organizations can address. But I've always felt that the more that people actually interact with North Korean people, the more we try to understand them, the more we can move toward a genuine reconciliation. Of course, these bigger issues are important too. Governments have a role to play. But at the end of the day, we're talking about 70 million people on the Korean Peninsula, genuine human beings which share the same dreams and interests and fears across the DMZ. My very first visit to North Korea was with a humanitarian NGO in the fall of 1997 at the peak of the famine. We were bringing food and medical supplies to remote villages and clinics. And the reception I found there was extraordinary. The depth of gratitude and the kind of connection that I felt with people there. And it gave me a great deal of hope that we can, within also the broader framework of a diplomatic resolution, peace and reconciliation between peoples, both between North and South and between the U.S. and the North.
Okay. I think there was one more in the back. Yes.
My paper, the paper of this judgment, but why doesn't Obama administration formalize the relationship with North Korea? Is there a reason to stop military? That both of you said that the only way that we think of at the moment is that we normalize the relationship or go back to 1919. But why does Obama administration go back to 1919 strategy or normalize the relationship with North Korea, please?
Well, I think that in the second term, where President Obama seems to be a little bit more adventurous than he was in his first term, there might be a hope that talks could get going again with North Korea and perhaps move toward normalization on the principle that I said earlier about diplomacy not being necessarily between friends, but between estranged peoples, between enemies. I think the North Koreans made a very bad mistake when, right after Obama was inaugurated, they blew off first a missile and then an atomic bomb, and the atomic bomb was on our Memorial Day. I noticed that the newspapers don't seem to get this when the North Koreans take a particular day, until finally on the State of the Union Address Day last month, when the North Koreans did their third atomic weapon. Finally, reporters put two and two together. But what it means is North Korea is, rather than just building up an arsenal for the sake of doing it, they're trying to send us a message. Their message is strategic patience is not going to work. We will end up with a nuclear arsenal if you're really, truly patient. So I'm hoping that since that strategy is bankrupt and the North Koreans have made their point once again, as Obama enters the second term, that maybe the air can clear and things can go back 12 years to agreements that were deeply in the American interest to pursue and conclude. I just wanted to say one thing more about the peace process that the lady eloquent question a few minutes ago. I think bringing an end to the Korean War would do an awful lot of good. Getting rid of the armistice, this is the 60th year anniversary of the armistice, establishing a peace agreement or a peace treaty with the United States and China and South Korea. South Korea is not a party to the armistice, but the other three are. And out of that form some sort of a framework so that North Korea doesn't fear us so much. So that it has, I don't think they'll ever take a paper security guarantee for something that will allow them to disarm or something. But I do think the statement that Clinton made to General Cho when he was in Washington at the White House, they signed a statement saying neither country will have hostile intent toward the other, that was a real start toward ending the Korean War and ending this condition of hostility. When you look at what the North Koreans have been saying lately about their missile launch and their third bomb, they keep saying, we do this because of the hostile approach of the U.S. and the unwillingness of the U.S. to give up this hostile approach. So it seems to me that those are a couple of steps that would really get us down the road of clearing away some of the worst obstacles to a much more stable and peaceful situation in Korea.
Thank you. I think we have reached our time limit here. Thank you very much for both of you.